I think we'll get started. Thank you for coming to the final session of the conference. Hopefully this has been a good week for you, sharing a lot of energy with each other. It's always encouraging to come to NACW and just feed off of what everyone brings to the conference. So appreciate you all being here and coming to this final session as well, where we are going to be talking about biochar. My name is John Remucal. I'm the Director of Protocol Development at the Climate Action Reserve. I was the lead author for the Reserve's biochar protocol, which allowed me to spend a good amount of time trying to get to understand and get to know biochar production and use systems. And I'm excited to be here with you all and with this panel here to be talking about biochar today. So I'm going to have our panel introduce themselves, and then we'll get into things. To my right, Jay Wintergreen, if you want to introduce yourself.
So, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us in the last sessions of this conference. Really appreciate the turnout. My name is Jay Wintergreen. I am the market area greenhouse gas management market area director at First Environment, based out of our Sacramento office. And First Environment provides greenhouse gas management consulting and also specializes in third-party verification services for a variety of programs, including Climate Action Reserve. And we're looking forward to verifying projects under CAR's biochar protocol. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Thumbs up. I know these mics have been a problem in earlier sessions. All right, thanks for coming. It's the end of the day. This is an awesome turnout. I certainly didn't expect this. My name is Lucy Buchan. I'm a director on the carbon project operations team at 3 Degrees. We're a global climate solutions company. We've been around for over 20 years or so. And what I do is oversee the monitoring, reporting, and verification, or MRV, for a diversified project portfolio that includes carbon dioxide removals and super pollutant abatement. I have 4 primary roles where I oversee diligence of, we do procure credits externally for our portfolio, as well as I manage our biochar project operations and verification with a focus on the Climate Action Reserve Registry right now. I oversee our clean fuel pathways in the North American compliance markets, and I direct our data-driven process improvement, which is currently including onboarding to a digital MRV system with Mangrove Systems. So let's get going.
Thank you both. So I'm just going to set the stage a little bit before we start getting into some of the questions that I have for our panel. So there was a very recent report that came out of Norway that that discusses the state of biochar as a CDR solution. In it, they cited estimated amounts of biomass feedstocks that are produced and could be used to produce biochar as being over 2 billion tons of carbon every single year. And they also note that despite that huge potential that represents, the ability to scale biochar has really been constrained by the overall demand for biochar as a carbon credit type, as well as just the physical product of biochar. At the same time, this contrasts really sharply with the perception of biochar for anyone who's in the know on biochar. If you're not terribly familiar with biochar, and probably more especially if you are in the know about biochar, we could probably spend this whole session just talking about how great and wonderful biochar is and what you can do with it. You take different forms of biomass, and in particular waste and residue biomass, and you can convert it into a highly durable form of carbon that's going to remain in place for centuries, if not millennia. And then you can take that product and you can apply it into a lot of different uses to help increase the productivity of soils. You can enhance the the properties of construction materials, and there are new ways of using biochar that seem to be coming out every day, every week, which presents challenges to us at a standards creating body where we have to try to keep track of all that and figure out how we can make adjustments to our methodologies to accommodate those situations. Lucy, I want to turn to you for the first question, just kind of getting at a general perspective of the market. What are you seeing with respect to the overall growth trends for biochar and carbon markets? I guess from both a biochar producer perspective as well as any insights that you might have around from what you're hearing from buyers.
Yeah, certainly. So, there's a lot of interest in biochar, and I've seen reports saying within the next 7 years they expect globally biochar production will triple to like a $2 billion market valuation. We are seeing a lot of interest in the form of most of the vintage through 2025 has already been procured, at least 90% of that, I think. We're also seeing that a number of governments or agencies are offering green CDR innovation funds and grants. So we're seeing positive trends there. I think of the engineered CDR carbon dioxide removal strategies, biochar is the most TRL ready, technological readiness level, TRL. And it's also, commercially ready. So there's a lot of interest in it. If you're an entity that has net zero targets and you want to incorporate removals, there are nature-based solutions, but the durability and other aspects of biochar make it quite attractive, and it's a little bit lower priced. I think other trends that I'm aware of, so I'm going to talk about a couple things that I would say are barriers, both for buyers and suppliers, and then sometimes barriers are almost, they're creating solutions. So one thing that we see is a strong demand by a limited number of buyers, right? There's generally, these are tech giants. They're now getting referred, and some finance companies, but they're getting referred to as hyperscalers. They've set ambitious targets, and they want to meet them. And in order to do that, they're interested in removals, and they're out purchasing them. Right now, forward purchasing activity outscales spot purchasing by about 10 to 1. That's in the recent supercritical report. And buyers are already contracting for 2026 vintages. But what we've also seen is there's a structural undelivery risk. And so about up to 54% of the tons are not being delivered. So there's contracts, and then, as I know very well from being a biochar project developer, there are lots of bumps in the road that we're hitting. And it's not always the pyrolysis equipment. There are many things and we can get into some of those details. So there's a risk. There's a small group of people that are motivated. They're finding that the credits that they want are not getting delivered. So what are they doing? They're starting to restructure their contracts. They're developing more mature contracts, which are including things like a cure phase. So if instead of just having a rigid contract that says you must deliver this many tons by this date, they're maybe building in a little bit of a grace period in there, saying, well, if you can't produce your biochar, you have a time to fix it and try and get there. And if you can't do that, then there might be some penalties. We're also seeing longer term offtakes, 7 to 10 years. And as a lot of you may know, there's a high CapEx cost to the equipment that goes into these they're infrastructure projects, right? High CapEx. And so to pay off that debt, you need something like a 7 to 10 year offtake contract. So what the hyperscalers, if I can just use that term because it's convenient, what they're doing is they're building more. They're interested in forward purchase contracts, and they have these ambitious targets. So what they're interested in are large scale projects. They need volume. They need a lot of credits. So they're focused on what we'll call industrial scale projects, which are producing upwards of 60,000 to 200,000 metric tons per year. So these are large projects with multiple lines of production. Concordant with that comes a rigorous diligence process. And I am participating in these, and it makes sense. They're making a big investment, so they're kicking the tires and digging under the hood and doing stronger diligence. And so that takes time and that takes resources to do that. So that's a really big trend that I see that's in response to some of the barriers. And I think one other thing is they're also taking what I'll refer to as more of a portfolio approach. So it used to be that buyers were really focused on a project and getting the full story and being very project specific. And now I think with all of these risks, they're much more focused on the criteria. Just wanting to know, are these projects able to deliver on time with permanence, the things that they really care about? Are they confident that they can get that delivery? And they're willing to, look at a portfolio of projects to achieve those objectives. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lucy. Appreciate that. One thing you'd mentioned is bumps in the road in terms of project development and actually getting them to fruition and getting them to a registry to be verified. Jay, I want to turn to you around this idea of project readiness. And we know that there are a lot of biochar producers that are out there they're interested in developing carbon projects. They understand that biochar can produce a lot of climate benefits. They also, in a lot of cases, need the revenue from carbon to support their business and to remain viable in the long run. From your perspective, are you seeing things that give you pause, though, in the sense that a lot of producers might go in and think, well, okay, I'm making biochar. It should be pretty easy to get carbon credits. But I think all of us up here know that's not necessarily the case. But do you have maybe some words of caution for someone who's going in thinking that it's just going to be an easy task to convert from just making biochar to actually generating credits as a result of that?
So we've been contacted by a number of biochar project developers, people who are interested in pursuing projects, pursuing carbon credits, and especially it's our interpretation that they're looking for this additional revenue for their operations. And one of the issues that we've seen, and it's not new to biochar, it's something that we've seen in a lot of offset projects. And one of the points that I want to make is, so I've been doing greenhouse gas verification since 2004, been involved in offset verification since 2008. And it's been interesting to see different project types kind of emerge and the issues that they experience as they start. And so I kind of have the perspective of, history doesn't necessarily repeat with these projects, but in a lot of cases it rhymes. And so we're seeing a lot of rhymes in these biochar projects of issues that we've seen with other projects that have made them slow to kind of gain traction. And then you see once they overcome some of these issues, then they tend to take off. And one of these issues is the difference between project activity and then the carbon project, which I think people have, people who come to pursue carbon projects, they think, oh, I'm making biochar, this is the carbon project. For me, producing the biochar is the project activity, and then the carbon project is the monitoring, the collection of data, the quantification, and then the presentation of all that information, first to me and then to the market, to demonstrate that you've produced this carbon removal. So we're seeing a lot of people who they come to us, they're interested in pursuing this, and they've been working in the project activity for extended periods of time, but they have limited experience in doing carbon projects. And it doesn't take very long for us to kind of see that they're not approaching this in terms of not only do I have to make the biochar, do I have to find a feedstock and produce the biochar. We have a lot of discussions with what the actual technology is associated with producing the biochar, but that's not really important to me. That's kind of important to the project activity. It's more important in terms of, again, how are you collecting the data? How are you managing that data? What's the scope of your project? And thinking about that in terms of how you're going to do your project activity to make the best carbon project. And again, another issue related to this is that I've seen before in a lot of projects is a lot of these project developers, they're coming in with very complicated projects, lots of feedstocks, a lot of different end uses or off-takers or things like that, maybe multiple sites that they're working at. And I repeatedly tell clients that, keep it simple. Start with something, even if you have a very complex project activity, try and focus the carbon project on a simple project, maybe a single feedstock that then goes to a single end user who has a single end use. And then be successful in that carbon project and then scale up. Then start mixing in these different activities, these different sites. Maybe also start with a very short reporting period, and then scale up to longer and longer reporting periods. Again, we want you to be successful. There's nothing that frustrates me more than having a verification client who is struggling. We're struggling together. I'm in there with them, struggling to get through the verification process. I just want to, I want you to have a good project. I want to sign off on your tons. I want you to, I want you to be successful. But you gotta come into the carbon project, being successful. And again, I think that's one of the things that I'm very concerned about in a lot of the projects that we've talked to is they may be biting off more than they can chew, and that just slows them down from reaching that objective. Maybe I'll stop there. But again, this is not something specific to biochar per se. We're just seeing it as kind of it's becoming a viable carbon offset project, or there's more opportunities for these projects with protocols like the CAR protocol.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
think one key difference for biochar projects is that they have to also sell their biochar and have that applied in an end use that qualifies. So for a lot of flaring methane or other things, you can just do the activity and you can go get those credits. Yeah, you could have shorter reporting periods, and then you can get your revenue more quickly. But with biochar, if you can't secure biochar offtake, and the project developer is also responsible for that, that makes it a little trickier. I would also say one thing that we've seen a lot is that a diversified revenue stream is very helpful. So a little bit of a counter to the keep it simple, because if a project developer oversimplifies and has, a single feedstock can really help in multiple ways, right? As long as it's secured. So a secured feedstock, critical. If you don't want a ton of variation, because that's going to make your processing more difficult. You want to have a consistent process so that you can get really strong carbon ratios and carbon content and hydrogen to carbon ratios. But having a diversified revenue stream is to your advantage. So can you get, tipping fees? Can you, relying on carbon credit revenue? That's going to take a while to get. And this concept of you can have short issuances, if you have to pay for verification each time, then those are real costs. So that can become a big impediment to having shorter crediting periods. And then, so there's a biochar offtake, but maybe you could have multiple kinds of offtakes. So maybe you're putting it into some compost. Maybe you're putting it into some soil remediation device, mats, or stormwater retention, having multiple off-takers so that as, there are floods and all of a sudden, there's a big demand or there's not a demand, right? You want to be able to have a resilient way, a resiliency in your off-take market so that you don't get stuck. So yes, keeping it simple, but I fear that keeping it too simple might also introduce a lot of risk. Yeah.
I totally respect that, and yes, I understand. No, ideally I want one in, one out, but I realize that's not realistic, and I've been told by project developers, in some cases, what would be the easiest to verify would be just not feasible. But I think, again, you just need to kind of balance some of those, as well as have a plan, like what you're describing with how you parse out that end use. That seems to be a very well-defined plan, and I think that's fine as long as you come into the project with. Again, you can handle more complexity as long as you have it planned and organized once you get to the project. But again, my suggestion is always, if you have, maybe the best way to say it is, if you have the option to do so, lean towards the simple as opposed to trying to go big, trying to make the big deal or do the big project first. Like
Right.
I said, and once you have success, once you have that first round of credits, then start thinking about scale up.
Certainly, yeah, and maybe it's more of a modular approach is another way to think about that, right? Like one unit, get it running, then you can expand to a second unit, and
Yep.
once you have some income coming in, that supports that expansion. But I think certainly, keeping it simple, but you also have to have enough diversification to be resilient. I think a couple other key things for project success. Basically you want to minimize your risk and maximize your certainty in everything that you're doing. So that relates to secured feedstocks, secured end uses, known end uses, proven technological ecosystems, I'm going to say. So what we've seen a lot of is that it's not necessarily the pyrolysis reactors that are difficult, it's the grinders that are getting gooped up or clogged or breaking, the conveyor belts, the water meter system, and then things like permits. Are you getting feedstock from somebody? Are you relying on their permit to get that feedstock? Are they in violation of that permit? Then your feedstock is no longer available. Did you know that all of a sudden the county doesn't really understand your project? They want you to build a stormwater detention wall around your entire project, and you can't get that permitted. Did you know you can't get your utility to hook up your electricity for several months? And in the meantime, they're just staring down this valley of death. They've rented the land, they're getting the equipment, there's all this CapEx, and they can't get going because of these logistical things that are beyond their control. But that really also speaks to, having a plan and building a model where you're not expecting 100% success and you're not expecting everything to go right, because it won't. It's not happening in any of our projects.
No, here. That's a valuable lesson, which is everything is not going to go according to plan, and there should be a buffer. Did you use that term? A buffer in place so that you have some buffer in your project in terms of time, in terms of all aspects of your project, because very few. I don't know if that's true, but it's not uncommon to see projects go awry, something unexpected to happen.
Yeah, and sometimes it's workforce, right? Do you have a trained workforce, and even when you train them, are they implementing the SOPs that you established correctly? We've seen issues there. I will say, also having a deep understanding of the protocol, understanding how to develop good SOPs, standardized operating protocols. So it's very clear. Whatever you're going to have people coming on your site all the time, different shifts, making sure that everything is standardized, making sure that you have strong data management systems. You need to be very data savvy here. It's all about chain of custody. You need to think like an auditor. You need to think like this guy. He's going to come on site. It's just like getting audited for your taxes. We all need to be prepared for that. You need to maintain your records, and you need to have them in an auditable format, all the way from, getting your feedstock, all of your diesel records, all of your electricity records, all of your water that gets metered, everything. This is a life cycle assessment, and you need to account for every bill of lading and every invoice. That all has to be managed. So data savviness, and minimize risk, maximize certainty, and think like an auditor.
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting thinking about just the amount of detail and documentation that has to go into biochar projects in particular. And, Jay, you've spoken to how challenging that can be for projects just to be able to put all that together, and how critical it is for them to be able to do that. And at the same time, Lucy, you've mentioned how, being able to have efficient systems to make sure that verification can go smoothly and project development can go smoothly is really important as well. It's really interesting to think about the challenge that biochar producers face in that, or at least a lot of biochar producers face, in that they're kind of operating on the margins a little bit, and they rely on carbon credits to remain a viable business. A lot of these projects, there are exceptions, but a lot of these projects that we really see coming into the market are pretty small. They're going to really be looking at credit issuances of hundreds to maybe thousands of credits a year. And we know that there's a lot of interest in having pretty frequent credit issuances, just because they can't bear costs for a really long time. They have cash flow issues, so they have to make sure that they have revenue coming in pretty regularly, and they're not sitting on those costs for a long time. So one thing this all points to, at least in my mind, is where digital MRV can come in. And I don't want to speak too much about it. I want to let the two of you talk about it. So Lucy, I guess I'll turn to you first, and just ask how you view digital MRV. You mentioned that you are working with a digital MRV provider, getting them set up with what you're doing. So I'm curious to hear what you see digital MRV as representing for what it can do for your projects, what benefits it brings.
Mm-hmm. Well, at 3 Degrees, we work on a very broad portfolio of project types. So part of the reason I'm bringing it on is, this isn't biochar-centric, right? But, thinking about the smaller producers, you can see that if, as long as the cost of DMRV is reasonable to them, and I assume it is, because, you see a lot of these new DMRV platforms are built for purpose for biochar projects. I think, CDR came out and biochar was technologically ready, and a lot of people were trying to do it. And I think for that reason, a lot of these young up and coming DMRV providers thought, okay, let's focus there, and we can offer DMRV, and we can help sell the credits. They're trying to provide a whole suite of services, which for small buyers is very appealing, because you can't afford to have all of that specialization in-house. That would be a lot of overhead cost to you. So I think there's a reason that we saw a lot of DMRV providers starting out in the biochar space. So it helps small companies in that manner, particularly. And then, just from more of a data management perspective, however, it's a way to, especially as you're going to scale, we're talking about lots and lots of data coming in. So if you can automate that data delivery, data ingestion, data QC, and the only time your human needs to come in is finally once you've run all your QC checks and you get the errors. That's when you need the human to come in and say, okay, I set these QC checks, what's going on, what's wrong, let me fix this. And then ensuring that your system, and this is really a big deal, as Jay will attest to. And if and when you decide to go the DMRV provider, make sure that they are tracking the chain of custody of your raw data is staying intact, and then you've got, your secondary data sets, and making sure that it's very clear what came in, what were the errors, how are they fixed, by whom, when, what was the updated version of that data set, right? And then how are those data then being aggregated into these, monthly or annual estimates and reported on? That chain of custody, that data tracking function has to be very sophisticated and accurately built into these systems. So I don't think I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, so Jay, we'll turn to you next. Just would be interested in hearing your thoughts in general from a verifier perspective on digital MRV, what kind of risks the use of digital MRV presents potentially, as well as what benefits you might see from the use of digital MRV from a verifier perspective.
So as a verifier, we started to hear about this concept of DMRV a little over a year ago. That's the term that was being used. But again, it's not. I think Lucy, you kind of provided a little bit bigger picture of like what it entails. For me, it's at the most basic, it's just computer software that helps you manage the project and manage the data. And it's, we've seen that in various forms for a long time. But we started hearing it in terms of the name DMRV a little over a year ago. And then it was very interesting. It seemed to be very associated with biochar projects, which I'm still trying to, I think there's some link to one of the crediting programs for biochar, and that might be kind of where this comes from. But I found it really interesting that, again, everyone we talked to referenced, they were using DMRV, or they were contracting with a DMRV provider or something like that. And so the first comment I want to make on that is just a little bit concerned when, we talk to a project developer and they want to talk about their DMRV first, in terms of, because that's not their project. We want to know about your project. What are your feedstocks? Where is it located? How many parties are involved? And there tended to be our project's running a DMRV. It's going to be easy. So sometimes that's a little bit concerned. And then there's kind of this double-edged sword as a verifier with any type of computer software, and also with some of these initial conversations we're having with project developers related to their DMRV. The positive side of it, which I think Lucy has represented, is that it gives you confidence that they have a structure, that there's some sort of formal structure that the project is running under, and that there's something that is helping them manage the data. Because that's what a lot of project developers need is, and especially under a biochar project where you have these large data sets, you have daily data points, you have just a lot of different data points that you're going to need to keep track of, and the DMRV should be there to facilitate that for you, to guide you through collection of that data, management of it, and then potentially visualization, help you manage your project, manage the project activity, and then ultimately work with the verifier during the carbon project to present all this information and help the project developer answer the auditor's questions. We ask a lot sometimes. We ask a lot of questions, and again, the easier that a project developer can say, okay, here's all my sales records from this period, or here's all my carbon content, lab reports, or something like that, it can greatly facilitate the verification process and can help that carbon project. So that's the positive, and again, that's what we're hoping for every time we see somebody using a software project or where they start describing their DMRV. The initial concerns that I have with that, and again, this is based on a history of kind of people saying, oh, we're using this software, or we're using that software, or something like that, is one of the concerns is that some of these products are one size fit all. And I know not all of them are, and I know that there's a lot of developers that they like to work with their clients to customize it. But essentially there are some limitations on these software products that, there's a structure. Again, going back to what I first said, there's a structure, and you have to work within that structure. And sometimes the project doesn't match well with the structure. And so that can be a problem. That can be a problem just for the project. And then when we end up seeing the symptoms of that when we get to the verification, and there's something about the project that just isn't captured in the software, and it's an issue. So the one size fits all. Then the even worse kind of issue, and again, forgive me, Lucy, but because I know you had a reaction to this when I said it before, when I said it previously, is sometimes with this software, what we end up seeing is, and again, this is kind of software development. Software development is I think at its highest form is meant to make complicated things simple. You use the magic of computer programming to do complicated things, almost like magic, and make it look simple. And so you might do things in the background, or you might have very complicated programming to do transformations and data aggregations and how you stack the data. And I'm not a computer programmer, but I know that, if you talk to computer programmers, they're most proud always when again, they provide this magic of, the software does all the hard work. The problem with that sometimes is that, it ends up a lot of important stuff. What verification looks at, we are all about transparency. We're trying to follow all this data from the monitoring to the end report to the end report. So we're literally, we talk about following the data trail or following the audit trail. You're going step by step. Okay, this is where it was collected, this is what happened to it, this is how it was aggregated, transformed, calculated, reported. So there's all these steps that you have to go through. And then the question is, can you see all those steps in the software? Is a good software will be able to, present each one of those steps. So there's a very linear path. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that for some reason, a lot of computer programs don't work like that. It's numbers in, magic out the back, and that's the black box. And for a verifier, when you run into the black box, it's because you don't know what happened in there. You just have numbers on either end of the black box, and then the verification becomes about taking apart the black box, disassembling what was done. And again, there are software providers, potentially DMRV providers, who are excellent at doing that, who are excellent at exporting things and walking you through. They can present emission factors, they can present the transformation factors, they can show you where the calculations are done, the formulas and things like that. And then there are other developers where, they send you 10 pages of code and, good luck with it. Or, you have a conference call with them and they want to talk in their language. It's difficult sometimes to talk in their language. And so it becomes an obstacle. So that's the downside of it. And so again, we're eager to see how that's going to manifest with DMRV in the biochar projects. Just one other aspect of DMRV that I want to kind of foreshadow here, if there's any developers out there, if there's any project developers who are using that, something that I think will be important, and I think actually John's going to talk about it, and it has to do with change management. And the fact that a lot of these, when we start a new project type with protocol version 1, usually then the first projects come out and then you start seeing improvements to the protocol, either through E&C or version changes and things like that. And that can be, historically, we have seen that can be difficult for computer software to incorporate in a reasonable time frame. So if you change, if you issue a new set of emission factors, is it easy to get that into the DMRV? Or again, do you have to start recoding stuff? Equations are the same thing in terms of, if you hard code equations into your DMRV, and an equation changes, maybe one parameter, maybe only you add a parameter or something like that. Is the DMRV provider going to know to add that in there, add it in the right place, and use it in the way that the protocol is intended? And so we've seen this in many cases where I did a verification where I'm sure the first time they did it was an inventory project, so not exactly the same, but I'm sure the first time they did the inventory, their software calculated it perfectly. I was on the 10th year reporting, and the numbers were all off, couldn't figure out what it was, and had to get into the way they were calculating it and realized that their equation, or actually their emission factors, were 6 years old. That no one had, the program had changed, the emission factors had changed, and no one had updated it, and it just kept calculating. But it was hidden pretty deep. It was 3 layers deep, that those numbers, nobody would have looked at it, except I couldn't understand why do you have the right data going in and a different number coming out of the black box. Traced it back to they were six versions behind, or a number of versions behind. So I think that's something, as we progress through protocol development, that people need to be aware of with these DMRV. Do you have a solid change management system in place to keep up with the latest and greatest?
Great. Thanks. I actually want to, just considering the time and how many people are here, I actually want to open it up at this point for questions from anyone in the audience. I do have some more questions, but if anyone has any questions for the panel, I'm happy to open it up now. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panelists, but actually it's a question for the moderator. The Climate Action Reserve published the Biochar protocol in 2024, if I'm correct. How many projects have gotten credits issued so far? Approximately how many credits?
Yeah, we have not had any projects go through verification yet. We have a number that have been listed on our registry, but we're having the first project going through verification soon. Yep. Jason, go ahead.
Jason Miller, work with Biochar product development, carbon crediting, Biochar sales and farming, physical farming. Question about financial additionality. You mentioned earlier about tipping fees. To all the different revenue streams, tipping fees being one of them, what degree does accepting, say, tipping fee compromise the financial additionality that would be necessary for a carbon credit? How have you seen that play out?
I don't think that's an issue. The capex for these systems is so high, and I'm talking more about like an industrial scale, not a flame cap kiln, right? But if you're building a capex heavy infrastructure project with, they need front loaders and backhoes, and I mean there's so much equipment, pelletizers and grinders and you name it, and scales, and so they need a diversified revenue stream. They need the carbon credits, they need the biochar revenue, and if they can get some tipping revenue, or maybe they're going out and they're doing demos to demo how their system works to make a little bit extra cash. They're very cash strapped right now. I don't think that financial additionality is an issue.
Go ahead, Aaron.
I was also curious, you've all touched on different ways to integrate biochar, but in North America, are there incentives or programs that allow for more innovation than in other regions, or what trends do you see?
Yeah, good question. I'm not as much aware of what's going on globally, although I am aware that certain countries, Japan and many European countries have what I'll call green CDR bonds or grant programs, right? And I don't know the exact quantities of those, but they're out there. Our federal government isn't doing much, but some of our government agencies are. So, for example, USDA NRCS has their 366 program. That's a conservation practice cost share program, which is excellent. There's so many agents across the country, and unfortunately, I think that not all of them are really aware of the program and know how to implement it with farmers. But that is a direct way to support the use of biochar in our agricultural fields. So that's one example of a cost share subsidy. I think USDA also has the Biochar Atlas that they're preparing. So that's a way to take existing research and combine it and empower farmers to understand, here's my soil type, what kind of biochar would be suitable for me to use. Of course, that's based on their soil type maps, so it doesn't account for if a farmer has been adding manure for 6 years, their soil is going to look different than the mapping. But for your native soil, and they're trying to bring in more and more research. And my understanding, and that's Kristen Tripp at the USDA who's doing that, and my understanding is that even people outside of the US, if their soil types are similar enough, they're actually going to that atlas, which started in the Pacific Northwest, is now applicable across USA, and for their similar soil types, they're going and looking and utilizing it to help them understand what type of biochar might be suitable for their soils. USDA also has like a hazardous fuels transport program, $23 million announced in May of 25, grants to transport dead or down trees to facilities that produce biochar, for example, and other materials. EPA recently just awarded a $15 million grant to the Tule River Tribe in California for a biochar project that's using forest residue to produce biochar and renewable energy. And I know that California has state grants. They're funding through CAL FIRE's wildfire prevention grants. $117 million were announced in 23-24. So I think what's going on in California is that there are a lot of agencies that are and groups that are working together. It's a little bit more of a modular approach. There's not one high-level, top-down program that's directing funds in one place, but there are multiple efforts that are going on. So those are a few things that I'm aware of. I know some other grants some other states have grant programs. And one last point on that. So I think some of these grant programs will be more useful for the smaller producers, because when you're building a large facility, you need so much money that $1 million is such a drop in the bucket that the amount of work that it would take to procure that is just not worth it. You need big investment from big banks, and so for the smaller producers, I think some of the grants and innovation funds at the state level might help them more than the large facilities.
And one thing that I would add too for California is that there is an effort between different agencies to kind of coordinate and try to support the biochar industry so that, this is going beyond just like, okay, identifying technologies that could be used to produce biochar in California. They're actually looking at ways to make sure that feedstocks are actually produced in a reliable way so that anyone who's producing biochar doesn't have to worry about having a reliable supply coming into them. And then they're also looking at the end uses that can be used in California and securing offtakes for biochar producers, ways that they can provide incentives that way. So there is, at least in California, there's an effort to try to help the industry in a pretty broad way across agencies. Yeah.
Just to add, I represent CAL FIRE. They work on a community forestry program, and we do offer assistance, grant assistance for urban wood utilization. A big push that we're trying to do right now is utilize urban wood, all the trees that get cut down from municipalities usually go to the landfill. So now we're trying to incentivize ways to utilize that wood, turn it into biochar, usable lumber, structural lumber. So if you guys have any questions about it, please feel free to reach out. We have, that's a urban and community forestry program. We also have wood utilization and bioenergy grants currently open. So we do have, we're pushing small-scale operations. We think the urban and community forestry program or larger industrial operations with other programs. And I wanted to ask you, how long does it take for biochar operation to receive funds through carbon credits? Let's say you start, is it 5 years, 10 years, or when do they see that?
I'm going to say from the first discussions that we start having with producers to the point of getting the first credits issued might be at best 3 years. You know, you need to understand what the project is and then get in there and really make sure that the data flows are set up, that they've got all the equipment on site, that, you know, they've commissioned it, they're testing. And then, you know, typically we do verifications on like an annual basis, and that's partly because of the cost of verification. You know, you want to have enough credits to, you know, justify that cost. So, you know, you're looking at some startup time. You finally get rolling, and then verification usually takes 3-4 months.
That's about right.
Yeah, so maybe around 3 years, 3-4 years.
Yeah, on the left here. So our updated protocol, version 1.1, it's unclear exactly when we'll be able to release it. I'm hoping sometime in May. Training, TBD on when exactly what we might offer that, but hopefully sometime shortly after that. Yeah, go ahead here.
I'm just curious, what protocols are you working with? If there aren't any other right now, what protocols?
At the moment, we're working with CARS protocol exclusively. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part of your question.
Well, I thought John said that there weren't any projects.
Well, we listed the first project, and we have 4 that are listed. What I also said is that we've hit some bumps and had a few hiccups on all of our projects, and those fall into those categories of permits, holding things up, weather. This is something I didn't really anticipate. These facilities are shutting down in August. It's too hot. We had a load of biochar catch on fire. So, you know, lesson learned there. Make sure now they're like, we have to add all like 15 to 20% moisture. We need to make sure that the biochar is that moist before we deliver it. And we've had just all of the equipment that surrounds the reactor. We've had multiple issues with that, as well as labor force. I mean, some of these facilities are in extremely rural areas. And even when they trained the staff, lo and behold, they discovered that you know, somebody thought more is better, and it wasn't, and that caused some really big problems. And also, you know, we've had some situations, understanding that with the technology, it works really well for this feedstock, but oops, when you try this one, it's not really designed that well for it. Or, you know, getting the consistent moisture content of the feedstock to ensure that, you know, you can have fairly consistent production parameters running it. So there's just a whole host of issues that come up and have come up in each of our projects.
Yep, here.
First of all, I wanted to say how impressed I am by this room being packed. That's really awesome for the last section of the day to see a packed room. There's a lot of interest in biochar. This is a question, I guess, for Lucy. What do you think is going to drive farmer adoption of biochar over the next couple of years as we see this increase of certain supply due to the carbon credit market coming online?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not a farmer, and I don't live in an agricultural community, but from what I understand is that a lot of farmers will learn from each other and kind of follow what they see people that they like doing. If they don't like somebody and they don't trust them, they might not follow their practice. So that said, getting field trials going is one way to do it. Having the indigos and the bears out there trialing these projects. I think there's a lot of space for NRCS to come along with that cost sharing program, right? Because it is pretty expensive to purchase the biochar, but I've heard several examples that when that cost share comes in, and they realize a yield bump, which is really what they're after, right? But they're getting a yield bump, they're saving on water, they're cutting down on inputs eventually. The other thing I've heard about the NRCS share program is that it has some limitations. So it only allows, it is based somewhat on geography and soil types, so it will allow more cost sharing and a higher volume of biochar in certain areas where the soils are more eroded and degraded. It also has some kind of an acreage limit, though. So if you're a really large producer, and let's say I'm just making this number up. Let's say it's 100 acres per year that they will implement a cost share program, and you have 25,000 acres. It's not going to do much for you, but for smaller producers, it could make a big difference. And then there's something about the volume requirement. Again, I'm not quite on top of it, but what I understand is that sometimes the amount of biochar that gets applied isn't as much as you might want for a given soil. So you might not see the benefits as quickly. You will see some benefits. You will see soil health, and you'll start seeing plant health, and that may likely translate into yield increase. But it may occur a little bit more slowly if you're only working through NRCS, because the application rates might be they might fund them a little bit lower than what would be ideal for your soils. So I think having the cost share programs, having the atlas, also providing that information, so because not every biochar is the same and not every soil is the same, and trying to figure out how does a farmer know that if I pay, and these are big experiments, right? They get to do this once every crop cycle, so how will I know that this char is good for my field? So again, if there can be ag extension, field trials, things that are going on, proof of concept within your agricultural area that's relevant to your soil type and your crop rotations, right? Then I think that's going to help a lot.
Yeah. Maybe we have time for one last question if there are any. Maybe we've exhausted that. Any closing comments from either of you? I think we're about wrapped up otherwise.
I'll let you have a last word. I mean, I guess, again, I think I'll echo what this gentleman said is, really pleased that, there were so many people who were interested in biochar to attend this session. This has been kind of a not to be, make a bad pun, but this has been a slow burn in terms of seeing biochar, as an offset project. We've seen a number of protocols and have gotten interested multiple times as verifiers. And so I really hope that, these projects, by the next NACW, there are many projects that are not only listed, but have received credits, and we can have a different move on to a different discussion about the future of biochar based on that experience. So really looking forward to seeing what happens with this project type.
Yeah, I think I want to jump on. I know your question was specific to what will encourage farmers to adopt biochar. I think I want to speak a little bit about, from the buyer stance, that one of the standardization is going to help, and one of the things that came out recently is a new lab standardization protocol from USBI, ANSI, and USABE. It's S668. That's a lot of acronyms and numbers to remember. But basically what it does is it provides standard language and testing methodologies. The testing methodology that we have right now, which was great, it was IBI set it up, but it's really a conglomeration of different standards from Europe and different places, and having a single standard so that a buyer can go in with confidence and say, oh, I'm an apple is an apple. This metric ton is equivalent to this metric ton when I'm looking at different projects, because I know that all of the lab testing is standardized. So as an example that I've heard, if you had a production level of like 10,000 metric tons and your carbon content, you get an 80% carbon content result from one lab, and you get an 85% carbon content result from another lab. That could equate to like a 2,000 credit difference, okay? So just that variation, which you will see across labs, and that doesn't build buyer trust when they're thinking about making these investments, and wanting to ensure that they're getting a good deal, and that there's no overcrediting or undercrediting that's happening on the basis of your lab tests, right? So I think that's a big thing to highlight. It's very nerdy, but it's very important to have some standardization. And I think, we've heard a lot about there used to be 2 protocols, now there's 6. I think it's a lot for developers to navigate. It's a lot for buyers to navigate. If what we're seeing in enhanced rock weathering through the Cascade climate effort is an attempt to, coalesce the community and come up with a standardized approach for that CDR methodology. In the case of biochar, if it would be feasible to create some kind of a standard view of this is the data that all of these protocols ultimately are providing, but through these different crosswalks. So that then a buyer could come in and say, well, now I'm looking at a project from CAR, I'm looking at one from Puro, one from Isometric. I have all these results, all these documents, all these different things, but I know how they relate up to this standard view of what a biochar project needs to contain. That could be helpful to buyers and developers, I guess, also in making their decisions on how to go between different protocols. So that's a bit on standardization. And then I just think, some key things that we've talked about. Think like an auditor, reduce your risk, maximize your certainty, secure your financing, secure your feedstock, your offtake, know your protocols, be savvy with your data management. Those are, I think, some key high-level takeaways that I would share with the group. And again, I do want to thank everybody for coming at this very end of the day.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists as well. And I guess we're done with the conference, so congratulations, you made it.